Thank you everybody for being here. Welcome to this event in partnership with the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies, the Center for Environment, Community, and Equity, and the Immigration Lab at American University. I'm Mentel, the president of Global Americans. For those who don't know about Global Americans, we're a think tank based here in DC, focused on Western Hemisphere foreign policy with a particular focus on democracy, development, and human rights. We have programs all throughout the hemisphere. We're publishing reports, commentaries, op-eds, articles every single day, and you can find us at theglobalAmericans.org. Particularly relevant to this conversation is we have a pretty comprehensive program looking at climate change in the Caribbean. And even more relevant for this conversation, we just published this report on climate change, migration, and indigenous and tribal peoples. So that will be the focus of this conversation. And I want to start by thanking our excellent team at Global Americans, including Jackson Mim, who's in the background there, Alejandro Trenki, Adam Ratzlaff, Bill Carlson, and Caio Pereira, who really led this initiative. We also have the benefit of a really world-class high-level working group that worked hand in glove with Jackson, Alejandro, and the rest of the team, including some of the folks on the panel here today. And our co-chairs of that working group are former Deputy Prime Minister of Barbados, Dame Billy Miller, former Barbados Ambassador to the UN, Liz Thompson, current Colombian Ambassador to the US, Luis Alberto Murillo, and former Costa Rican President, Carlos Alvarado. I also want to thank our wonderful audience again here with us and the panel for being with us today. So the idea of this event is to have a conversation broadly about all of the issues in this report and all of the issues I think at the core of climate change discussions today. And kind of the way we typically like to do this is keep it as engaging, dynamic as possible. So at the end, we'll definitely have questions for the audience, but for the panelists here, if somebody says something that you want to comment on, by all means, feel free to poke me, write me, or just jump right in. So before we start, I'm going to do quick introductions, and then we'll do the first round of questions. So I'll start on my left here. Allison Fedirka is the Director of Analysis for Geopolitical Futures. In addition to analyzing and writing about global geopolitical issues, Allison helps guide the firm's forecasting process. Prior to joining Geopolitical Futures, she worked for Stratfor's Latin America Regional Director. She's also, and we're very grateful for this, a member of the Global Americans High-Level Working Group on Climate Change in the Caribbean, and she provided a lot of substantive recommendations that made its way into this report. Robert Albro is a research associate professor at the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies at American University. He earned his PhD in sociocultural anthropology from the University of Chicago, and since 1991 has conducted ethnographic research on popular and indigenous expressive politics along Bolivia's urban periphery, with a particular attention to changing terms of political participation, indigenous identity, and citizenship as part of a grassroots-driven change in that country. Ambassador Carlos Fuller is the permanent representative of Belize to the United Nations. Prior to his appointment, Ambassador Fuller was the regional and international liaison officer at the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, where his primary responsibility was to coordinate CARICOM member states in the international climate change negotiation process. Ambassador Fuller holds the George Price Lifetime Achievement Award for Emergency Management and the Officer of the Order of the British Empire for Public Service. He is also a member of the Global Americans High-Level Working Group on Climate Change in the Caribbean and has also provided a number of substantive recommendations to guide this report and these reports as well. Betilde Muñoz-Pogossian is the Director of the Department of Social Inclusion for the Secretariat for Access to Rights and Equity of the Organization of American States. She has a PhD in political science from Florida International University, and for over 20 years, she has led missions, projects, and research in areas such as democracy and elections, equity, and social inclusion, among many others. At the Department of Social Inclusion, Ms. Muñoz is responsible for leading the work of the OAS in the inclusion of populations in vulnerable situations and in the promotion of the full exercise of their human rights. So with that, we'll start the first round of questions, and I'll start with you, Betilde. Migration, we know, is a complex issue across the Americas. People are constantly moving for economic, political, and humanitarian reasons. And perhaps no region in the world faces a greater threat from climate change in the Caribbean. As the effects of climate change worsen, the potential for intra-regional and extra-regional migration flows increases. So given that climate change is increasingly playing a factor in driving people out of their places of residence, how does the OAS and how do you see this phenomenon today and going forward?
Thank you, Guy, and thanks for the introduction and the invitation to join this very interesting conversation. Of course, congratulations on the launch of the report. I was mentioning to your colleagues that it's very encouraging to see that more research is being done on the intersection between migration and climate change, because it's a factor that induces migration, but it's not often as evident as a flagrant violation of human rights or violence against potential migrants. So this is why we often do not see it so salient in policy and political conversations on migration. So it's great that we're getting more research done on this. Regarding your question, perhaps I would like to touch on 3 points. The first one is regarding the region and its exposure to extreme climate events, and where we see some of where we are mostly concerned both in terms of the subregions, within the Americas, as well as vulnerable groups. The second point on some of the actions that could be considered moving forward, which is part of the agenda work that we have at the OAS, and finally, just briefly share with you some of the things happening within the OAS. And when I talk about the OAS, I talk about, of course, the General Secretariat, where the Department of Social Inclusion belongs, but also what the member states have been discussing and what they have been prioritizing in this regard. On the first point, one of the issues of concern for the OAS is the impact that extreme climate events have on particular sub-region of the Americas. You already mentioned the Caribbean, but of course Central America is also an area where we have a lot of work and where we also see the greatest threats. Of course, Caribbean, Central America, along with Southeast Asia, are the regions of the world most exposed to extreme climate events, and not just, and we always talk about climate events in general, but really these regions are affected by the slow onset type of climate events, coast erosion, but also droughts and the like. And of course, the more dramatic sudden onset, such as hurricanes and volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, that tend to catch our attention and that are covered by the news. But it's much more complex than what we see during hurricane season. Of course, each of the countries have different climate-related challenges. I'm not going to go into detail, but perhaps the common denominator in all of them is that it's not just the economic or human losses associated with this type of affectations, but also how this tends to impact people's livelihoods in the medium to long term, which, according to some of the research that I've also done, confirms ends up producing or causing people to internally migrate, and then of course have the out migration usually to the US. And another point of concern on the first area that I wanted to touch on is how it affects, as in any crisis, the most vulnerable, right? And of course, the report goes into depth on the issue of tribal and indigenous populations. From the standpoint of the research and the follow-up that I want to do, and I'm permanently doing, is affecting also women and children. As we know that from data that the UN has reported, that around 80% of those affected by climate change are women and children, but we also are seeing what is now being termed as feminization of migration. Also, just to put, I'm not going to go into detail in the interest of time, but just to put those points out there. On the second point of recommendations, I also wanted to bring to the conversation 3 things. One of them, or a couple of them that I wrote with my colleague Diego Chavez at NPI for FIU, for the collaboration with Southcom. Number one, the fact that, or the way that we kind of concluded in the paper, is that climate events in and of themselves should not cause this level of damage and cause migration. And there is like this important call to countries to, for disaster preparedness, to ensure that all the infrastructures are put in place and they're really prepared to withstand the passing of this type of events, and especially to recover from them. The second point that is perhaps more juridical in nature is that a review of all the legislation that we have in the Americas confirms that we do not have a category of protection for people who move due to climate-related events. No, not going to go into detail, but this is something that where we believe there is a gap, no, in terms of protection needs for these type of populations. And the third point, also moving forward, is the need to document these stories of migration that are related to climate change. and have a better grasp at the data, because a lot of this intuition are anecdotal, but we need to really make very evident the impact of climate change on people moving. And on the last point, just to say that in terms of the OAS, what we've seen progressively is that countries have decided to prioritize the issue of climate change and migration in their or try to bring it to the top of their priorities. We, for instance, support the Committee on Migratory Affairs, CAM, at the OAS, and there have been a series of sessions delving into the issue of climate migrants that have actually translated in resolutions. And you could say, okay, well, that's another paper, it has no importance, but it really kind of establishes consensus and agendas of work at the regional level that I believe are very important to keep this conversation going. And also, as part of the collaboration with UNHCR, the Commissioner on Refugees at the UN, we have been supporting Central American countries on addressing displacement needs. And this only is recent, but of course it's important that they did it in 2022. For the first time, they decided to prioritize the issue of the climate refugees. So it's an ongoing work. They need a lot of support on our part, but of course it is very important. And on the standpoint of the Inter-American human rights system, just to mention that the Commission, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, produced a resolution on the issue of climate migration, but more importantly, at the beginning of 2023, Chile and Colombia did a request for a consultative opinion. I'm translating as I go. Una opinión consultiva to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights on the issue of climate change. But the last point of that request addresses the issue of how to protect people who are displaced because of climate change. They don't say it, they don't even use the term climate migrants or climate refugees, but the conversation will start on whether we should have a category of protection such as that. And of course, in the OAS is where all these agreements are negotiated. So hopefully this is something that will come to us. We will see.
Thanks so much. You mentioned the United Nations, so I'll turn it over to Ambassador Fuller. The Internal Displacement Monitoring Center assessed that from 2008 to 2021, approximately 9.6 million people were internally displaced due to natural disasters in the Caribbean. In June of last year, the UN Secretary General described the Caribbean as ground zero for the global climate emergency. How would you describe that global climate emergency, and how would you respond to the regional and maybe the international response to it?
Sure, but thank you very much, Guy, for the invitation and for joining this fantastic panel. Well, first of all, recognizing that the Secretary General has his Assistant Secretary General, Ambassador Selwyn Hart from Barbados, who is really has been at the forefront of the drive on climate change issues, first within CARICOM and then at the UN level. And so, indeed, I think he is really reflecting what we have been saying from the beginning. And the beginning goes back to the OAS. It was in 1994 that CARICOM heads of state who were in Barbados for the first meeting heard about the potential impact of climate change in the Caribbean. And they turned to the OAS for the first regional project to address climate change, which funding from the GEP and the World Bank. And so that began the process of the Caribbean getting ready for climate change. The observing system, doing the vulnerability analyses, putting in the policy frameworks, and then beginning to do pilot adaptation projects to get ready for climate change. As we moved along in that process, the heads recognized that we could not go from project to project. So they decided to institutionalize the process by establishing the 5 Cs, the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, which is there to coordinate the region's response to climate change. Recognizing that we could not go from project to project, but in fact, build a structure that will then get us all working together to build our resilience. So reducing emissions, getting adaptation measures in place, using our forests to also address the issues of climate change, doing all these things comprehensively. So from then we've been going, developing projects. When the Green Climate Change Fund was established, the 5 Cs became one of the implementing entities and is now attracting the kinds of projects we need. For example, in Barbados, they have a huge water problem. They got a $45 million project to strengthen the water the water sector in Barbados. And these projects are now continuing across the Caribbean, getting the buildings ready for severe weather events, putting in agricultural systems that can respond to extreme events and the slow onset events. So these things are now being in place. And in fact, now I think we are building our resilience for it. However, the climate change the impacts are increasing exponentially, becoming more frequent. The extreme events and the slow onset events are occurring. And at a level that we are very concerned. So, for example, there are things we don't know if we can actually get prepared for. For example, the bleaching of the coral reefs. As we know, temperatures are now about 1.1 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level. But the incidences of coral bleaching are coming in much more regularly. At 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is this great 1.5 degree target, our reefs have about a 50% chance of survival. At 2 degrees, they're dead. So, and the coral reef is really the backbone of our tourism and our fishing industries. So with that, indeed, we will become a desert in the Caribbean. And the migration that you're seeing now will exacerbate if that does occur. Sea level rise, and we're seeing now affecting the coastlines of Belize and across the Caribbean. Massive erosion now occurring. We have one village in Belize where it had about 60 feet of beach. That is now gone. The first 2 rows of houses are now in water. The cemetery is underwater. So that's now affecting the populations across the Caribbean. So indeed, there are things that we can get ready for, the things that have gone beyond the pale. And so regionally, we're getting as ready as we can. But internationally, we need to see much more mitigation action by the major emitters. And I'm not saying developed countries, I'm saying all major emitters, because for too long, we've been hearing the big developing countries, China, India, Brazil, saying we need development space. But I'm sorry, but that is also affecting us now. So we're telling all of the emitters you need to address that issue at the international level. And then finally, at COP27, we finally had a decision to put in financing mechanism for loss and damage, which is what we require if indeed we don't have a fishing industry, we don't have a tourism industry, people migrating. Some resources must be provided for our countries to be able to then start to move people either internally or to other places to survive.
Allison, I'll turn to you. Betilde mentioned in her remarks this idea of the lack of a concrete legal definition for climate refugees. As climate change worsens and becomes a key factor in driving contemporary migration, how important is this need to establish a definition? And if we collectively agree that it is extremely important to establish that definition, we know that climate refugee and climate migrants are among the most popular terms used to describe the phenomenon today. Can you explain the sort of political and the policy implications of choosing one versus the other?
So first of all, the idea of consensus on talking about this is important, because with any policy or with any political conversation you're going to have, you all want to be talking about the same thing when you sit down at the table. And so if there's not an agreed upon definition or concept agreement of what are we talking about here, you're not going to make much progress. One person's going to be going to the left, the other is going to the right. There's a lot of room for miscommunication, in addition to just regular diplomacy always having a lot of room for miscommunication. With the idea of refugee or migrant, the report outlines it, but the big thing about the idea of refugee that would be a huge complication, I think, for policy and politics in general, is you need to have a causal link. And so how do you prove that? People who are political refugees or even war refugees have to prove this anyways. And sometimes it's very easy. If you look at a location, you can say, okay, great. You know, political prosecution, that's a little bit harder. And there's plenty of people who maybe don't get that status that are seeking it and probably should receive it. So staying away from that when it comes to climate, I think, is important at this time, because proving that causal link is going to be extremely difficult in terms of being able to address the needs of these people. If you can't prove it, especially if it's something, you know, over time, right? If there's an earthquake or there's a hurricane, you have a better shot at it because there's a specific incident you can look at. At the same time, you can also make the argument then, well, how is this hurricane different than all the other hurricanes that you've already had? Why is this one special? Why should we give you refugee status? Whereas if you go with migrants, it opens up the space to include some of the effects that Betilde was talking about, and also Ambassador Fuller, which is over time, we're going to see larger impacts of climate change that aren't going to be as immediate as, say, hurricane, which is what we always use in the report because a lot of these are coastal countries. So with that in mind, I think migrating is a great word to use because it gives a lot more flexibility. It allows you to address larger parts of the population. It presents a more difficult conversation because you do need to distinguish between, okay, what is a short-term issue versus a longer-term issue? It will distinguish between the two. And if you're going to address policies and politics, you may find that those conversations take separate avenues, in which case you have to have a policy for longer-term climate change issues and maybe for more disaster relief. How do you distinguish disaster relief from what we're talking about now? Because in the past, I think a lot of the times when we've looked at climate change issues, it's been through the framework of disaster relief, which is a one and done kind of deal. You send in your water, you send in your medical teams, you mitigate the immediate problem, and then you leave. Whereas if we talk about it now through climate change, it becomes a much more different conversation that has a longer term impact and would require a longer term policy and approach to it, as opposed to just mitigating the emergency crisis. And really thinking about it more in terms of a big picture type of cohesion that would have dimensions both at the national level, regional level, and international level, just because as Ambassador Fuller alluded to, the causes and the ground drivers behind all of these changes are often out of the control of the countries that are most affected by them. And so, especially because of that, again, the idea of having a consensus for what are we talking about and what terminology are we going to use will become increasingly important, because you're going to have a lot of different actors with a lot of different viewpoints coming together and needing to be on the same page for how they want to address this issue.
Thanks so much, Allison. Professor Albro, I saw you nodding to a lot of what Allison was saying. So I want to give you the space to comment on actually anything that you've heard in this first round of questions, but I also want to ask you a more specific question. Sure. So you can take either or both, but there was a report that the White House issued in 2021 on the impacts of climate change on migration. And the Biden administration noted in that report the need to create, and I quote, a new legal pathway for individualized humanitarian protection in the United States for individuals who establish that they are fleeing serious, credible threats to their life or physical integrity, including as a result of the direct or indirect impact of climate change. What do you make of that piece of the report? What do you make of the Biden administration's commitment to this sort of novel element of climate change and its impact on migration? And how feasible do you think it is to get a greater consensus around these questions?
Sure. So again, thank you for bringing this panel together. I appreciate the opportunity to have the conversation. This is a problem that looks very different depending upon the perspective from which you're addressing this problem. And when we think about this problem as a climate-specific problem, I think there's things we can say. When we think about it as a migration problem, we become suddenly greatly limited in what the art of the possible looks like because of the intransigence around this issue in our political debate today. So we see that, so on the one hand, it's extremely encouraging that the Biden administration took the time to make the effort to generate a statement around linking climate and migration. Unprecedented and very encouraging. And so insofar as that's the case, it's one indication of the ways in which this administration has made climate change, broadly speaking, a priority, right? And we see that with funding and with other initiatives. At the same time, when we look at the migration piece as connected to this broader question, we see an administration that hasn't really moved on from the previous administration in clear and sharp ways, and in some sense has continued some of the previous administration's policies, and even recently seems to be doubling down on some of those. Partly this is because it's a lose-lose scenario. There is no good political outcome around the problem of migration and innovative policymaking in that space right now, for lots of reasons. So what I see from a US specific perspective is unfortunately somewhat of a pessimistic take for the immediate present and foreseeable future. where space has closed around policy efforts to generate, innovative pathways. We can point to things like TPS status, temporary protected status. That is the typical tool that we have traditionally used and continue to use to provide relief for populations that are, by all accounts, refugee populations in the context of mostly natural disasters. And I really appreciated the comments, Allison's comments on that very point, because I think that that's sort of indicative of the kind of weird ambiguity we insist upon around this set of issues. I think, so I'm going to back up half a step. I'm with respect, partially disagree around the issue that we currently have no a legal standard to address the question of climate migration. I think that Latin America, in particular Latin America, has been an innovative policy region over time, beginning 1984, Cartagena, to the present. And if we could, summarize that in a few brief, broad brushstrokes, it's taking the 1951 Refugee Convention and moving it beyond the narrow definition of persecution, religious, political, otherwise, and adding questions of vulnerability to violence. And climate upheaval and violence start to get very closely connected here. And so when we talk about the vulnerabilities of climate migrants, we're talking about the policy tools available to us to address those vulnerabilities. And at least in Latin America, there's been a steady effort to broaden the bandwidth around who is included in categories of victims of violence who are in the mode of displacement or migration. So I actually think that there's a positive long-term progressive effort there that we can point to that distinguishes the region in contrast to other parts of the world where we just don't see this, where instead you see a kind of, doubling down on and a shrinking of the room for maneuver there. That said, beyond temporary protected status as a kind of inadequate tool, I think we can also point to another problem, which is kind of the conceptual difficulty of reconciling. So that typically this is put as the problem we need to solve around identifying the role that climate plays as a driver of migration. I actually think that's a fool's game. We're never really going to adequately, for a policy level of discourse, reach a point of clarity around the specific role that climate drivers play in any sort of unitary fashion as a driver of migration. And so I think rather than getting bogged down in what is essentially an empirical, methodological, research-oriented problem of figuring out what are all the causal drivers thereof, I think it's better to simply avoid it. And but the result so far has been that means that we tend to prioritize one-off disasters, as you were saying, and a lot of the clarity around the work that people can do, humanitarian aid, monetary commitments, questions of loss and damage are articulated disproportionately weighted toward the disaster framework and of things. And that continues to be a problem because you're absolutely right. Disasters are discrete events that have a clear beginning and an end. And that's why we see them as understandable and more dealable, right? Because we can deal with them and then move on. But unfortunately, that's only one sort of expression of the broad climate disaster. So all the slow onset factors that are going to be the radically environment altering dimensions of things are in weird tension with the moment when someone decides to migrate. And this idea that that can be directly linked to those things, I think it's just a place we're never going to reach, right? And so instead, we have to find ways of embedding an understanding about human mobility into broad-based multilateral climate legislation. So I think instead of this idea that, maybe a given US administration will eventually make positive headway in creating space around, the recognition of climate refugee or climate migrant. We can talk about that. Because I think the sun is basically set on climate refugee as a viable policy multilateral category post Nansen, and with the new compacts, it's clear that that was a failed effort. So I think migration is the game at this point. But I think the only way to really do this is at the multilateral level. We saw that with loss and damage. Global North countries did not want to do that. They resisted it for multiple COP meetings. It finally got to the point where it wasn't viable for them to do it anymore. We will see if real commitments occur. And by COP28, we might be sadly looking at nothing having been done, which would be a familiar story. But that's the kind of progress that we've been making. So if the US is going to make progress, it's going to be because it's part of a multilateral process at an international level where it's one among many simultaneously making that commitment. And that's kind of the only way I see those things happening. And so I think, relying on the US Congress to make changes is not a good strategy.
Speaking of multilateral processes, I'm going to turn it back to you. The Inter-American human rights system has moved towards securing the rights of indigenous and tribal peoples in the hemisphere. And that's part of the report here that we haven't yet touched upon around the questioning. As an example, the 2016 American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples recognizes the rights to self-determination as well as the right to protect and manage their oceans. Nonetheless, some countries have failed to recognize indigenous and tribal rights. So what steps do you see the OAS taking to ensure relevant stakeholder buy-in, particularly at this intersection of indigenous and tribal people's lands and this question of climate?
Yeah, well, just on a couple of points on the declaration, for all of us to share. It took 17 years to get that declaration negotiated. And year after year, it was very hard to get countries and also the indigenous people who were also sitting in the negotiation to agree on a route to ensure and protect the rights of indigenous people. So it's been challenging. Not all countries of the OAS are party to the declaration. And even the countries that are not party to the declaration have been trying to establish legislation and policies to protect the rights of indigenous peoples, but unfortunately, there hasn't been strong, hard commitments on this. It is a process. It's something where we have to keep insisting and really, what's the word? Raising awareness and having countries know the contents of the declaration, empowering indigenous people who sit at this process to know the contents. And well, this is something that we have been very much engaged at the Department of Social Inclusion, but perhaps some of the actions, I want to share some of the actions that we've done to get to that buy-in that you're mentioning. Number one, the Department of Social Inclusion is mandated by the member states to be technical secretariat in terms of the implementation of this declaration. And we've done this sort of as a mandate, trying to highlight good practices in terms of ensuring indigenous people's rights, also as they relate to migration and climate change, their rights to environmental rights as part of the Protocol of San Salvador. Webinars, engaging with the tribal populations, writing reports, sort of to keep the momentum and the conversation going. Another example of something that we have been doing at the OAS is work with the member states, and they have actually established an Inter-American Week of indigenous populations where different topics are prioritized, and we go deeper on the issues, and of course the issue of ancestral rights of these populations has been part of the conversation. I'm happy to report also that on March 20th through the 23rd, we will have the first meeting related to, first Inter-American meeting related to the declaration, American Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. Is going to take place in Guatemala and Antigua, where really the stakeholders are going to decide whether there should be a mechanism to follow up on the progress towards the implementation of the contents of the declaration, and of course the issue of environmental rights and the like is very much part of the conversation. I have nothing else to report so far. I will let you know when we're back from Guatemala, what's going to be the outcome of it. But these are some of the mechanisms that we have in place to get to the buy-in that you're mentioning.
Ambassador Fuller, Professor Albro had a big chunk of his answer, I think, was quite optimistic. He spoke about the innovative nature of Latin American countries in addressing these problems. He spoke about the 1984 Cartagena Declaration on Refugees. My understanding is Belize is the only Caribbean country that signed on to that. So in this vein of optimism and kind of thinking innovatively about these issues, what can we learn from Belize on this question of climate change migration?
Well, first of all, could I?
Yeah, please.
The UNFCCC, in fact, I was substitute chair when the UNFCCC actually established the Indigenous Peoples Platform, local communities, which I think is a fantastic breakthrough. And the committee is formed 50% by Indigenous peoples using 7 different regions using their own selection capacity process and the UN process. So we have a platform now where Indigenous peoples can interact with parties on an equal level. I think that will inform the whole issue of migration and the whole issue of how can Indigenous peoples get ready for climate change, but also contribute to the solutions to it. So I think that is a major breakthrough, and I think we now need to empower that platform, because while the platform meets at the international level, we now need to trickle down to the regional, to the national levels to get the inputs from the various indigenous peoples around the world. So I think that is something that we need to recognize. On the issue of Belize and on migration, as I think the report mentions, and as Allison mentioned, to me, the issue of migration refugees is a spectrum. There's no one, you move from one to the other way, whether it's a major event or a small event, and the issue of violence and the gang trade and the drug trade and all that, everything is blended together. So we have a broad spectrum. And in fact, the issue has been affecting Belize in the sense that in the 1960s, Belize had a population of less than 100,000. Today, it is approaching 500,000. So here we are within 40 years, actually, increasing population fourfold already. And people don't realize that's happening. The demographic picture of Belize has changed. We were primarily a Black population. Now we are more Hispanic. So all of these things are happening in Belize. And we recognize that a lot of them are migrants who have come across. And although Belize does not have a policy on migration per se, we do have one on refugees. So as the migrants try to become incorporated in the process in Belize, they start to say, well, they apply for refugee status, which we readily accept. And in fact, we are hoping that that this year we can actually regularize 40,000 migrants into the regular workforce in Belize. They have been contributing tremendously, but they have not been able to access the banking systems, going to schools, contributing to the formal economy. They are all big agricultural producers now. So in fact, we don't see any difference among them, whether you're a refugee or a migrant, because we want you to become part of the system in Belize. So I think Belize is really working very proactively with the IOM and the USAID to get them involved in the process. And I think the US recognizes that Belize could actually contribute to the entire issue addressing the migrant crisis in the dry corridor of Central America.
Allison, I'll turn to you. I'll give you the opportunity to respond to anything that's been said, but I also want to speak a little bit about some of the forecasting that we have in our report, which, as might be expected, we forecast increased migration flows due to climate. Can you speak a little bit to what is being done with many of these migrants destined for the U.S., particularly from the Caribbean? What is being done by U.S. policymakers and multilateral fora to kind of deal with these kind of forecasting rates? And then is that response, do you think, commensurate with what we predict? It's a big question.
So I think the biggest challenge that we're going to see on that front is for the countries where people are leaving and for the people themselves that are leaving, this idea of migration and the projections forward matters much more to those individuals in the countries in the Caribbean than it does to the United States. That's a callous way of looking at it, but when you are a big country like this, every country has their own needs and every country has their own priorities. I don't think right now the idea of Caribbean migration ranks highly on the agenda of Washington with everything else that's going on. That said, I think if we can frame the discussion along the idea of, say, hemispheric security or hemispheric stability, then you give a whole new dimension to why should we care about this issue. And in that case, you will be able to make stronger arguments for why does the US need to have a policy to address this? Why does the US need to worry about these migrants? Why do they need to have a way to possibly accept them or address the root causes and do some type of, say, private-public partnership in the home countries to help mitigate the root causes of migration from the beginning. On that, I'm going to build on an idea that Professor Albro brought up, which is the idea of migration in the US right now is not one that you really want to touch. So there's, as I said, it's a lose-lose situation. And so when we think about this particular issue of Caribbean migration, one of the other major challenges is that the US isn't going to talk about just Caribbean migration on its own. It's going to be part of a broader immigration debate. And how do we reform immigration for the country as a whole? And that is extremely divisive, extremely explosive. And so dealing with it specifically as migration, I think has been alluded to already. Now's not the time to think of it in that specific lens. But if there's a way to link it to hemispheric stability or security, and then also, this is where I go back to private-public partnership, bringing US business, there's a lot more to be had in terms of how can we address some of these issues. The US government doesn't throw money at problems the way China does. But they do love to use the private sector to help solve these problems and incentivize them with other means that way. So there's things that can be done, but it involves looking at them from a slightly different perspective of what's in it for the US and how do we deal with it through the constraints that the US has on itself, both with domestic politics and international demands that they have to deal with, in addition to what's going on in the Western Hemisphere.
Thanks so much, Allison. Professor Albro, I'm going to push with this topic a little bit more here. I'll put my cards on the table a little bit. I spent some time in the Senate and worked on the Judiciary Committee, which had immigration under its purview. And I agree with both of your analyses that the political environment is not one in which either party wants to be very forward-leaning on this immigration question, unfortunately. But there was a time, a decade or so ago, where there was, where there was the Gang of Eight that was willing to engage on questions of migration. Professor Albro, I know you've studied grassroots movements, indigenous grassroots movements in Bolivia and elsewhere. Do you see a world in which there is a grassroots push to be more active on immigration, and we return to a political environment in which the United States government is willing to invest more in migration? Or do you really think the solution is much more, as you mentioned earlier, kind of with the innovative approaches taken by Latin American Caribbean countries and more multilateral fora?
So short answer is I think it really is the second option. You mentioned that I had given an optimistic answer before, which struck me as surprising because I didn't intend for it to be an optimistic answer. I was just a realistic, realpolitik kind of equation. So if we think briefly about recent US history around immigration and immigration debates, there are a couple of moments we might reflect on. One is the failed effort, Gang of Eight, second Obama administration, which was the last big push anyone made to kind of make real change and break, gridlock around this issue, and it didn't work. I would also mention the broad, and we were encouraged to think about the sort of social movement dimensions, the broad social movement efforts around Dreamers and the status of Latino citizenship in 2006. And that was a huge social movement groundswell that lasted for a considerable period of time. And it is reminiscent of, the response to, George Floyd and with Black Lives Matter. And one thing that one might say about both of those moments is they are performatively spectacular. But I think we can unfortunately point to very little specific concrete outcomes from those movements, except if we think of the predicaments of the dreamers, right? We're still talking about that category of person as a kind of wedge issue that is it's a representative in symbolizing a broader set of immigration debate related questions. And yet those folks, it's as if they've been suspended in amber. I mean, like nothing has changed, from 2006 to now. It's actually unbelievable, if you think about it, that even that seeming bipartisanship is absent. And similarly with George Floyd, what do we have? We have sort of failed discussions around police reform. That's kind of the legacy now, right? And now everyone's short attention spans have moved on, and we're voting out mayors who are interested in this, doing such things, and kind of turning.
There's a specific city you're referring to?
I lived there for many years, so I'm sympathetic. But anyway, so again, that's a pessimistic response. But I also wanted to compliment Allison's response about sort of how you rejigger or refocus the narrative in ways that might be more conducive to actual activity, and this idea of hemispheric security. So on the one hand, I really agree that that is what you have to do, and it has to be a way in which the key question, in this case, kind of a relationship to climate migration, is packaged as part of a larger set of necessary steps to take, say, around hemispheric security. My one worry about that framework, though, is that it implies and tends to bring with it a set of other assumptions. One is that mitigation is the main thing we should always be doing, almost exclusively, at the expense of attention to things like adaptation. And in a funny kind of way, the call to pay attention to the risks run by climate migration for hemispheric security is one to eliminate the likelihood of climate migration rather than preparing for the inevitability of climate migration. And so what we get is a lot of talk about climate resilient infrastructure and investment. And it's not that that's not important. It's very important, right? So I don't want to be misunderstood to mean we shouldn't be thinking about those things. But it tends to ignore that notion of resilience as communities in place and building resources for those communities. Kind of reminds me of our long-standing policy around migration efforts with remittances, which I'm frankly tired of hearing about. It's not that remittances don't happen. It's not that remittances aren't important, but the idea that we should put all our eggs in the remittance basket so as to keep people from moving is kind of not just inadequate, but sort of inaccurate. And so it's premised on this idea that the way you deal with the security problem is you keep people from coming, right? And when we think of Southcom and the DoD, to their credit, they've been out in front on research around climate, and even during periods of kind of U.S. hostility to leading around climate, DoD has steadily, quietly been funding climate research, but in part that means that it has to embed that research in a narrative around climate as a conflict multiplier. Right, because otherwise Southcom doesn't have a point, right? And so so Southcom has to find justifications for conflict. It's found one in climate, and only thinking about that in that way, I think in the long term is very attenuated, right? And it's not that there aren't connections, obviously, between exacerbating climate conditions and rapidly altering environments, displacement, and conflict. There are. And we need to understand them much, much better. But we shouldn't invest all our efforts in mitigation and conflict management, right, as the only kinds of ways we think about this. Because what it does is it ignores the fact that people are going to move, and it leaves us very unprepared and leaves that problem extremely underthought.
Thank you, Professor. I want to make sure to reserve time for folks in the audience to ask questions. But maybe I'll do one quick last round here. I'll turn it back to you a bit. Illicit economic actors, and this is part of the hemispheric security piece that Professor Albro was just referring to, like transnational crime organizations, artisanal miners, and human traffickers, often already are preying on marginalized communities like migrants. Can you speak a little bit to where the OAS and its partners are looking to respond in the context of climate migrants and potentially falling into the hands of those actors?
Perhaps, a couple of key points on marginalized communities, and this is actually the mandate of work that we have in the Department of Social Inclusion, is that migration is not experienced by everyone the same way. And looking, for instance, in the particular situation of women, children, or women and girls especially, but it also includes boys, we know that human trafficking tends to, they are overrepresented within the victims of human trafficking, which puts them in, probably mostly in terms of from the standpoint of transit countries and once they settle, right? But it exposes them to a series of other awful crimes like sexual exploitation, forced labor, organ harvesting, a series of other things. So that's one point, always in these conversations, to understand how these processes affect women and children differently. And then the second point that I usually talk about, the cóctel peligroso, no? The dangerous cocktail of xenophobia combined with machismo, aporophobia, racial discrimination, etc., and how these people who are migrating also are facing this cóctel peligroso, no? This dangerous cocktail. And from the standpoint of the illicit activities, I'm not going to address that because we have an area within the OAS, the Department of Public Security, that is doing a great job at designing regional agendas of work and connecting authorities in each of the countries to address human trafficking and design protocols and find better ways. It's always, once they think of a good way to identify these networks and capture them, they come out with a new way, very inventive way to continue with this search. But this is addressed by this department of the OAS, the Department of Public Security. They're doing a great job at that. From the standpoint of what we do in social inclusion, perhaps mention as an example the work we do with ministries of social development and in cooperation with trafficking authorities in the countries, of course, coordinating with our colleagues at Public Security. We recently had a ministerial meeting in the Dominican Republic, and the member states decided to work on the implementation of what's called regional guidelines. Let me see, read the proper name. Regional guidelines for the social inclusion of survivors of trafficking in the Americas. And this is something that we'll be working with the member states in, for now, 6 pilot countries to try to see how we try not to talk about victims anymore, but survivors of this scourge. And then the other point, or the other activity that we're doing is a concrete project with Venezuelan migrant women, and specifically training customs, immigration authorities, etc., on how to transversalize a human rights and diversity perspective in the work they do on dealing with survivors of human trafficking. So those are some of the examples of things that we're doing at the OAS.
Maybe I'll ask one last question and then I'll open it up to the audience. And I want to ask, Ambassador Fuller, I want to ask you about the Garifuna people, which are one of the hardest hit communities in Belize by climate change. And I want to do it because we had a really robust conversation now on climate migration, but I want to kind of close, if we can, centering Indigenous and tribal peoples as we close these rounds of questioning. Can you tell us a little bit more about this community, how they've been hit by climate change, what Belize is doing, and what you might expect in the next couple of years?
Sure. So the Garifuna people have settled on the southern coast of Belize. So they are actually people who came from St. Vincent and brought across by the British and settled in Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, and Belize, speaking their own language among themselves, but in Belize also English and the other country Spanish. But they have the Garifuna language as their native language. So they're fisher folk, primarily living along the coast and farmers. But they have been seeing their coastlines eroding tremendously. We are trying to address it in two ways. First of all, trying to find what is the source of the erosion, because we can always see sea level rise, but we also know it's issues with water downstream, developments upstream are affecting it. The banana industry has diverted some of the water from the river to do irrigation and putting back in a different river. So there are different things. So we're trying to find out what is the source of the erosion. And we actually have a great group of Cuban scientists came in and have now looking at where the sand actually went. And the idea is that we will then regenerate the beach using the original sand that you don't want to mix up the different types of soil and sand together. So we will be looking at that as an engineering solution once we find what the source of the problem is. But we also have a pilot project with the IOM of doing some internal migration work to see, indeed, if these communities have to move, where would they go? And would they assimilate with an existing community in the interior, or would we have to put it, a different community altogether? So we're not doing two issues, addressing the problem, and then in the event, as you said, we need the issue. You cannot only have a imaginary line. You need to have, suppose it breaks, where do you then put them? So you're looking at those two ways.
I want to open it up to the floor to see if there are questions from the audience.
My name is Jordi Amaral. I'm a freelance researcher and writer. I'm the author of the America's Migration Brief newsletter weekly, all about migration from Canada to Argentina and the Caribbean included. I wanted to thank all of you for taking the time to speak with us today. Very insightful comments. My question is directed towards Ambassador Fuller. You mentioned briefly the regularization program that Belize is currently conducting. I'm wondering if you could speak about that a little bit more. I know it was, the expiration date on that was prolonged a further 3 months, I think it was. So if you could speak a little bit about that, if you have any numbers in particular, that would be really, great to hear. And thank you again to all of you.
No, and thank you very much for the question. Indeed, we were rather disappointed that we did not see the outflow that we thought would be coming in. So I think it is less than half of what we expected of the 40,000 were actually came through. So we've been trying to actually have mobile clinics going out to various communities to see if we can attract them that way, as opposed to having them come into the capital to get the paperwork done and so on. So indeed, we've extended it. USAID has been very helpful in that regard. Funding these clinics, getting mobile registration community teams out to the various areas to get them to become part of the process. And we really don't know why it is that they are not responding. It's possible that they just don't have the paperwork to be able to present. That may be one of the reasons. But indeed, as I said, we are rather disappointed that it's not achieved. But I don't think we'll actually stop doing it. So even though maybe the project per se would end, I think we'll continue to advocate for these irregular, I call it irregular legions to come in and become regularized. Because in my opinion, they're already legions.
Ambassador, if I may compliment, just on the question of why this is anecdotal, based on our colleagues that are in country. Apparently, one of the limitations is the fact that, for instance, Guatemalans or mostly Guatemalans who may benefit from this amnesty don't always have the passport. They don't have identity documents for them to be able to sort of go through the whole process. And there's a need to ensure that Guatemalan consular services can be deployed to Belize and have these populations access their IDs to be able to do the rest of the process with Belizean authorities. And just to add on some of the things that we are getting, nothing confirmed, but perhaps it can help illustrate the situation on the ground.
Very helpful. Thank you.
We have other audience, but yeah, please.
My name is Daniel. I'm a WCL student in LM. I'm currently working at the Betilde Work and Research Office and working with the CARI Coalition, the Capital Area Immigrants' Rights. And I would like to know, I know you were talking about the TPS, and of course, the US government has created immigrant benefit for the trafficking victims, which is the T visa. But right now, there is no way that the victims of the climate change can be included as part of the five grounds of the asylum. Because the five grounds are race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion. But how might the state policy or federal policy send climate change's impact role as a driver of migration at the border and within the US? Taking into the account that Title 42 is coming to an end, but the Biden administration has proposed a new policy which is even worse than the Title 42.
It does seem to be worse. So he was looking at me, so I think I might have some insight there. So I really don't have much to share with you there. And the reason is simply because of kind of the ground that we earlier covered. I do think that if you look regionally across the Americas, there's some room for maneuver. And I alluded to that earlier, but not in the United States. And I think part of what you see with, efforts to elucidate with precision, a research basis to establish a category of rights-bearing category of climate migrant is in many ways kind of an indicator of the failed policy circumstances here. In a kind of weird sort of way, kind of a reflection of a very STEM-focused problem-solving approach that we tend to assume as, we need the data and the data have to be conclusive and they need to look like this. Otherwise, what are we talking about? And as I was saying earlier, I don't actually think that that's a reasonable or productive approach in the short or long term. I think that instead, much more likely is a very roundabout way of dealing with problems of security and regional conflict. And you look at Haiti. I don't see any reasonable way in which one can kind of separate out the environmental impacts that have, over the last, at least since the 2010 earthquake, successively pummeled Haiti and the failed state that Haiti currently seems to be, right? Clearly, they're a driver, but there's no way we're going to ever get some kind of useful political policy clarity there in a way that would lead to some special status for Haitians. The best we can imagine is what we already have, TPS, right? And I think what the game will be is to kind of go back to the de facto relaxing of concern around statutes of limitation around TPS that we saw, in the aftermath of the 1980s with Central American migrants, right? And returning, in a post Trump universe, and kind of returning to the idea that you can kind of, permanently extend TPS indefinitely extend TPS. That's the absolute best scenario I can imagine. But that would only happen in successive Democratic administrations. So Biden would have to win the next election, and then there would have to be a Democratic president after that, and then because that would all immediately end.
I want to see if anybody else in the panel has a response to that question. No.
I know, but I had a question to Rob on, isn't Haiti also included in the humanitarian parole policy?
Yes.
So they have those
Yeah.
two options.
We
TPS?
haven't talked about it. You're exactly right. That is the other tool.
And actually, some Republican states try to locate it, but yesterday
That's
the
right.
judge turned down.
Yep.
the-
You saw that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's Venezuela, Haiti, and
Nicaragua.
Nicaragua.
and Cuba.
yes.
So there you're combining
Political and other
And on
factors.
the other side, there's collective of lawyers trying to get
Yeah.
that the TPS can get the people access to the green card, but it's a long battle.
Right.
Yeah.
That sort of goes down the same rabbit hole as kind of the dreamers.
Yeah,
Like finding a pathway that we hadn't yet discovered through some kind of creative bringing together of different sorts of parts of a larger picture.
Yeah. Also,
Very
the
sad.
Venezuelan community in the US has been also advocating for a sort of what you're describing, a pathway for Venezuelans to go from TPS status into permanent residency and eventually citizenship, but we will see. something that takes time.
Yeah.
and
Oh,
Political will.
Right, one weird thing, and I would just say this, and I really don't have anything really concrete to back it up. But as the type of migrant changes, so I think we could say with a fair bit of confidence that so long as American policymakers perceive of migrants as primarily economic migrants from vulnerable and poor communities, we know what the political calculus looks like. But and I'm just thinking of like South Florida a little bit, and as we get migrants from formerly affluent societies who are not necessarily who are members of professional classes and embedded in financial and information economies, they become powerful diasporas, and that actually then opens up possible avenues for things like, you need to let me do business while I'm here, so on. It's not a green card, but right, that's the only thing I can conceivably imagine changing. Yeah.
I have, yeah, like, this is a little out there, but just brainstorming, right? Thinking of creative solutions of what you could do. So in the spirit of linking some of these issues to other issues that would matter to the US, or how do we strategically think about dealing with them? Demographics, right? If we think about these communities entering the United States in terms of demographics, labor skills, brain drain, people coming in that aren't necessarily undereducated, but people, like look at the oil community that left Venezuela in the 90s. Went to Houston and basically kept up the US oil companies there for quite a while. So you have that group of people, and I think you can also start thinking about some of these things. Dreamers could potentially be involved in sort of this type of idea of what kind of workforce do we need? What kind of people do we want to bring in? Especially if you look at declining birth rates in different countries, especially developed countries, the idea of people coming in to help replace the labor shortages that countries are expected to experience in the next 20, 30 years. Then we can start thinking about some of these people coming in as well, in terms of labor force, human capital, and not just thinking about them in terms of migration, but economic contributors, economic players that are part of this bigger spectrum of how do we keep the US economy booming in times of lower birth rates, or changing demographics, changing economic sectors that go away from certain things towards more IT, or changing economics, things like that, which is a much longer term, like I said, like 20, 30 years out. It does nothing right now, obviously, which is not very helpful. But this is, again, something that's inevitably going to happen, and something that's not going to stop within the next 20 or 30 years. And so there's short-term and long-term ways to kind of think about how do we incorporate some of this into broader strategies.
A new information economy bracero program, perhaps.
Yeah.
But just on that point, it's interesting to note that right now, with the massive layoffs happening in Silicon Valley, you see a bunch of people on immigration visas caught betwixt and between, and actually there hasn't been much movement to figure out how to keep them in the country. So you would think, oh, these are critical information economy workers, and Silicon Valley is a critical linchpin of the US technological advantage in this conflict we seem to want to keep going with China. And yet, oh, we'll just let these folks go because their visa expired, because they're no longer employed. Bye. So that just shows you there's really a lack of
But I want to say, Allison, it's not that far away already from the Caribbean. The US companies, schools are going to the Caribbean to recruit teachers, and the hospitals to recruit nurses. So there's already that, and there could be other things, because we do have that competitive advantage, the English language, with educational systems. So we could become providing that young workforce that those will need in the future. Yeah.
I want to see if we have any other questions. Yeah, please.
Hi, my name is McKenna. I'm a BA student at AU. And thank you for this panel. I have a Caribbean background, so this region is very important. And this question is for Angela. We're thinking about the Caribbean. A lot of economies in the Caribbean are sustained by tourism, and ecotourism in particular. How do you respond to mostly white folks who are moving to the islands and settling, more or less settling in regions that are already in distress. And because Puerto Rico in particular after Hurricane Maria, there are white folks who are moving to Puerto Rico and natives on the island are asking, please do not come here, we're still in recovery. What is the correct way to approach that situation? And Ambassador Fuller, I'm looking directly at you. So I guess, what are your thoughts on how to address it?
No, indeed. So it is an issue in Belize. Our big tourist hotspots in Belize, Albro, and so on, they already be stressed because we've already depleted the groundwater resources. So we have to put in desalination plants. The sewer systems can't handle it. So indeed, we need to now regularize that kind of development. We certainly don't want to cut down more mangroves to put in things, but there are other parts of the country that are other attractive. So we need to make those places attractive, putting in the infrastructure, getting electricity, the roads, the hospitals, so that they will go to areas in the interior, away from the hurricane-prone areas, and actually settle there. Because the rest of the country is also beautiful. So indeed, I think we ourselves have got to regularize the people coming in and put in alternative spots for them to go. And you go to the beach to enjoy for a day or a week, but then you go back home in the interior.
Somebody else.
Just very briefly, I would say it's not maybe a race dynamic, it's an affluence dynamic. And so you have people with expendable income seeing opportunities and taking advantage when there's depressed, real estate in places they would like to have an extra house, right? And I agree with you that it creates disparities, and it also disregards long-term residents, native communities, indigenous and tribal communities, and creates all kinds of problems. But on the other hand, it's also a driver of the economy. And so one of the problems becomes how to have a just and equitable tourist trade. And I mean, different countries have experimented with this. Costa Rica is the obvious example, and so on. And I don't know that we've worked that out, how to have a just and equitable tourist trade. Tourism is inherently exploitative, but it's also inherently an economic engine. Right, and the Caribbean has to kind of double down on that. So you're right; it's like right at the center of both of those two very, very, serious issues.
To that point, a little bit outside of the region, but I'm Portuguese American, so it's an example close for me. But Portugal actually is having somewhat similar experience with lots of tourists, people from the US, UK moving to Portugal. And that greatly changing rent prices and stuff. And to that idea of how do we approach it equitably, just a couple of weeks ago, actually, the Portuguese government announced a new policy limiting being able to build more like tourist-oriented housing and setting new price caps on what rent could look like. So time will tell how that policy ends up playing out, but it could be interesting.
Yeah, it's wild because I mean it's basically similar to the equitable housing policies that we have all across urban spaces in the United States. It's really the same conversation. Long-term residents, often minority community neighborhoods, disproportionately impacted by gentrification or whatever. And this is kind of a global gentrifying thing. Yeah.
Any last questions? Yeah, please.
I have a quick follow-up question for Allison. You mentioned that if policy-wise, if we actually kind of turned it around and made it sound like a security kind of issue so that we can have more policies around this. And you mentioned something about using private and public partnerships. From an economic development standpoint, I feel like, or I guess my question is, would you feel that there could be some hidden agendas with that deployment of private and public partnerships that go into these regions who are already suffering and might be more of a hinder to the area than an actual preventative?
So yeah, so the whole idea of a stability framework is countries will participate in things that they think they have an interest in. There's, my personal opinion, very little altruism in international relations. Every country has their own agenda. So that's where the security framework idea comes from. How do you get buy-in? As for alternative agendas, absolutely. I mean, that's it's a question of how do how do you construct them? How do you manage them? What kind of projects? Who's behind them? Things like that. And the idea of public-private partnerships came up specifically because if you want to look at how any U.S. role would have in terms of financially participating in projects, I think that's the more likely scenario that we would see. It's not because I think I also mentioned like China, for example, is the exact opposite, where they have government funds that they put wherever they want. They're not very successful at all of their projects by any means, but that's how, if you wanted to bring in U.S. money into some of these areas, one of the frameworks you could use. I think there's a lot of examples in South American countries of where it's worked well and where it has not worked well. And so it's really not a catch-all solution, but it's one possibility, but the devil will definitely be in the details of what that actually look like for each project.
I think with that, we might close. I want to thank again the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies, the Center for Environment, Community and Equity, the Integration Lab, and American University for hosting us. Thank you, Ernesto. This has been a wonderful conversation. I feel very grateful to be alongside you all on this panel and to share in this great report that our high level working group put together that Jackson from the Global Americans team helped lead. And to have this really important conversation. So thank you all for being with us. Thank you for being with us in the audience. And we look forward to many similar conversations in the future. Thanks so much.